And I showed you that video because this year we're stepping out on a limb. We've reserved 30 spots so that middle schoolers and high schoolers can go to Camp Snowbird. It's located right outside Andrews, North Carolina. And I don't know about you, but that's a camp that I would want to go to. It is an incredible camp. They get spiritual input, insight, build great relationships, and have a blast. And so what we want to do is we want to send people, if you would like information about the camp, just email Shannon. She'll get you the information. She'll let you know how much it is, the deposit that's required. We're going to have fundraisers to help all the kids offset the cost of the camp. If you would be interested in sponsoring a camper this year, just let us know. But we're going to be saying more and more about it. The dates are June the 8th through 13th, so block that time out. Get in touch with us, and we will give you all the information. And there's a couple of little things I want to bring you up to speed on. First of all, I told you a few weeks ago that there was a church that we were considering buying. And that sounds funny, to buy a church, right? But there's a church that wanted to move. They wanted to sell their building. We went in, we looked at their building. We fell in love with their building. However, we did all of our research, and we are so far apart on the price. What it's actually worth and what they're asking, we are $1 million apart. We just could not justify it. And so I want to pray for this church because they need a certain amount to move on to what they believe God is calling them to do. But we felt at this time it was just not wise stewardship to invest that much in a facility. So we feel like God has shut the door there. By the way, there's a great verse in Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9. It says, man makes his plans, but God directs his steps. You know what's even better than that? God makes his plan and directs our steps. And so what we want for Be Renewed is exactly what is God's plan. We don't want there to be any mystery whatsoever. And so when he opens a door, we walk through it. When he doesn't open a door, we're totally okay with that. And so we feel like, okay, God, that wasn't it for us. And we will continue to do our due diligence and look. And when we find that facility, we will let you know. However, on top of that, I wanted to let you know that I had contacted Wake County, and we had inquired about possibly moving to a different school. We've had a little bit of issues here. Remember, 4 out of 5 weekends, our air conditioning didn't work. And you may not know this, but 30 years ago, I actually started Hope Community Church in this school. Now, this auditorium wasn't even built 30 years ago. We started in the band room. And we were there for about a year and a half. And then I got a call one day. The principal said, you're going to have to find somewhere else to go. We're shutting down the campus for a year. We're remodeling. There's wind that's going to be happening again to this campus. And so I have started looking for another campus for us to move to. Let me just say this. We're looking at 3. All 3 of them, it just so happened they all came open at the same time. They're all pretty new. One is 2 years old, one particular we're looking at. Anywhere I move, for some of you, it's going to be closer. And for some of you, it's going to be a little bit further drive. But before we even get into that, I just want you to begin praying, God, do you want me to be a part of Be Renewed? Because to me, 15, 20 minutes on a Sunday morning is not that big a deal one way or the other. I drive 35 minutes here. I live in Harnett County. I have to go by all the goats and get by all the John Deere tractors to get here on Sunday morning. But, it doesn't really matter to me the distance. But so just begin to pray about that. We'll let you know more. One of the things I'm looking for, though, that's important to me is that we have a building that families can walk in together and they can stay together. And for example, I want the families to walk in. I want the kids to be able to go down to one hallway to their classes, for us to go into the auditorium. One school I'm looking at, it's got a big atrium area, so we can have coffee and donuts on Sunday morning and fellowship a little bit. I think it'll just seem more like church and more like a family. And so we're going to have to make a decision in the next few weeks. Just pray about that. We'll let you know as we're heading in that direction. And just the other thing I would mention is several individuals. I told you when we started the church here, we were not going to be full of staff. We're not going to be top heavy with staff. I'm only looking for people who have the ability to equip the saints to do the work of ministry. I believe that that's the plan that God has called us to. And there's one of those individuals in particularly that has become available recently. Unfortunately, he has become available. And we've been talking a little bit. I would love for him to possibly become a part of Be Renewed. He's at the stage of life. He doesn't need a full-time job. He can work for very little. And so you just pray about that. I would encourage you. I would love to see our giving. I don't say much about giving, you know that. But if we could just up it a little bit, that would give me some security. We actually have a big old nest egg over here that I am protecting because I believe that God has plans for it. Our regular giving is very, very good. But if we could up it just a little bit, for example, if you haven't engaged here financially, consider it. That's up to you. That's between you and God. If you are giving, if you could just up your giving maybe 10%. If you give $100 a month, say, I'll give $110 a month. Whatever it is, that little bit of extra money will help us, and this individual will be an incredible asset to our church here at Be Removed. So I just want to put those things out for you to pray about, think about, and we'll be keeping you updated as to where we're going to move in all these different directions. Now, if you're visiting for the first time, we are in a series that we're calling Authentic Faith. It's based on the Sermon on the Mount. It's a sermon that Jesus preached in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. This week's message I'm calling Radical Counsel for 21st Century Christians, and you're going to see why I call it that in just a second. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of a history lesson, and there'll be a little bit of a test inside of this. So let's see how well you guys listen to U.S. history, okay? Every generation down through the history of our country has had its slogans. I mean, if you go back to the 17th century, when we were just a few colonies and we were taking on England because we wanted to fight for our independence, there was a guy who came on the scene by the name of Patrick Henry. And he made a quote that many of us remember because of school: give me liberty or give me, right. What was he saying? He's saying, you know, liberty, that's something worth fighting for, maybe even dying for. And that attitude is what bought us our independence. Think about this. 2 centuries later, a war broke out in Europe. We wanted no part of that war. It didn't bother us. It didn't bother our borders. We wanted to stay away from that war if at all possible. But the Japanese did something that changed everybody's attitude about World War II. And there was a slogan that came out of that event: remember Pearl Harbor. See, 3 of us went to Durham County schools where you got an education, right? Remember Pearl Harbor. And it seemed like that one saying, that one slogan, it served to provide enough patriotic zeal to keep us focused, to keep us on track as a nation. In fact, it's interesting. If you study your history, you will find that period during World War II, we've probably never been as united as a country and as sacrificial as a country, because everybody was pulling together, moving toward a common goal. When you get to the 60s and 70s, things begin to change. It was a time of hippies, Woodstock, free love, flower power, right? Everybody was kind of doing their own thing. And the slogan that came out of those days was, if it feels good, right? Now think about it. That slogan grew out of a time when national allegiance was giving away to defiance. Civil rights, human rights became front and center. During that period of time, we had not 1, not 2, but 3 assassinations. President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. Robert Kennedy, who was running for presidency, was assassinated. Things began to shift in our country. Vietnam, a war we were in, was referred to as the unwinnable war. And as Americans, we hated that because we had never lost a war. But guess what? It proved to be true. You may remember President Nixon had to resign over the Watergate scandal. And as a result, again, there was a shift in our nation, and we became very, very suspicious of authority. It was also during this time that traditional values like the family, the school, the church, marriage, those things began to be called into question. As a nation, we became very, very apathetic. It seemed that possibly the American dream was slipping away. And over time, that apathy took its toll, and it created a different mentality in our country. And it was almost every man for himself, and we began to think about our rights. We were focused on our rights. We even got accustomed to sayings like in the news media and over the television, you deserve a break today. Where did you deserve a break today? At McDonald's. How about have it your way? Burger King. You got rights. You should have it the way you want it. In fact, our culture became very, very me-centered. People began to live by mottos like, I don't get mad, I get even. Yeah. Do unto others before they do unto you. And we became as a nation more and more hostile. And we've become a nation pretty much with a chip on our shoulder. We got our rights. we'll have a fight anytime. But see, that's the way it is when you're strong and yet at the same time selfish. And as a nation, we have become a very strong nation, but we've also become a very selfish nation. And everybody's got their rights. Now, let me just say this. All of these things brings us to some of the most difficult words that were ever spoken by Jesus. In fact, we don't really like these words. What we're going to talk about today doesn't sit very well with us. In fact, we're not sure they really mean what they say. So I just want to encourage you as we jump into this part of Jesus' sermon that maybe we just kind of sit back a little bit, take a deep breath, maybe lower our defenses. I understand that as we get into this today, you've probably fallen victim, like many of us, more to an American theology instead of a biblical theology. And as we do that, as a result, it's easy for us to get our lifestyle more from the nation we love than the Bible that we're supposed to believe. And when that occurs, even as Christians, we can kind of read the Bible, and we can read into the Bible whatever we want it to say rather than what it actually says. So I'm going to ask us to try not to do that today. So let me show you what Jesus is going to talk about. Jesus begins this part of his sermon by quoting perhaps the oldest law in the history of civilization. Let me show it to you. Matthew chapter 5 verse 38. He said, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for a tooth." Now, most people probably assume that Jesus is taking that directly from the Mosaic law, and he is, but you need to understand, Moses was not the first person to ever hear those words, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This was actually part of the code of Hammurabi. You say, well, who the heck was Hammurabi? Hammurabi ruled over Babylon for 2285 to 2242 BC. I only mention that because that was 700 years before the Mosaic Law. 700 years before Moses ever came on the scene. This is what it says in the Hammurabi Code. If a man has caused the loss of an eye, his eye one shall cause to be lost. If he has shattered a limb, one shall shatter his limb. If he has made the tooth of a man fall out, one shall make his tooth fall out. By the way, that's a very diplomatic way of putting it, right? If you knock my teeth out, I shall make one of your teeth fall out. Very diplomatic, right? Understand, this was 700 years before the Mosaic Law. Now, let me read some verses from the Bible. Exodus 21, verse 23. If there is a serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Why? You have your rights. That's your right. Leviticus 24, verse 18. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same way. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. Why? Because we have rights. Deuteronomy 19, verse 21. Show no pity. I doubt you thought you would ever see those verses in the Bible. Show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Now understand, the audience that Jesus was speaking to that day when he gave the message, the Sermon on the Mount, this is what they had heard all of their life. These are the rights that people had been taught that they could cling to for centuries. But now Jesus comes on the scene. It's like there's a new sheriff in town. You've heard these things all of your life, but now Jesus talks to them, and he's not talking to them about clinging to their rights. All of a sudden, Jesus shifts, and he begins to talk about the importance of us as Christians releasing our rights. In fact, there are 4 areas of rights that Jesus addresses. First of all, my right to personal dignity. Well, we don't even like the way that sounds. I've got to release my right to personal dignity. Here's the second one, my right to cling to comforts. In other words, my right to cling to whatever pleasure makes me comfortable. Here's the third one, my right to a private lifestyle and schedule. My right to do whatever I want, whenever I want, for as long as I want. It's the American way. And here's the fourth one, my right to the exclusive ownership of my possessions. In other words, what is mine is mine. Now, those are the rights that we feel like we have in our culture. In fact, if any of those rights are threatened, I can pretty much assure you somebody's going to end up in court. But as you're going to see this morning, Jesus says, nope, that's not an option. I have a different plan for you. Now, let me just clarify something before I go any further. At no place in this message does Jesus address the government of a nation, okay? This is personal counsel for the Christian. Government responsibility is not the same as a Christian's responsibility. As a Christian, my responsibility is to follow the teachings of Jesus. It's just that clear. Government's responsibility is to protect the citizens, serve the people. Understand when Jesus is teaching this, he is speaking to people about their personal lives. And basically he's saying this: if you're going to follow me, this is how you do it. If you really want to be my disciple, this is what it should look like. So again, please don't make these principles for government. They're for us. Are you ready for this? Hold on to your seats. Here we go. Here's the first one. Release your right to personal dignity. Notice how Jesus puts it in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. When I was growing up, there was an evangelist who would come to our church every year. His name was Joe Boyd. He played for Texas A&M. He was an All-American. After he finished playing college football, he became a Christian and an evangelist. And I remember him because I love football so much. And even as a small kid, I can remember him coming to our church. But I'll never forget him telling the story about right after he became a Christian, he had a date, and he had gotten dressed up in a beautiful suit, and he was going to go pick up this girl for a date, and he ran to some guys that he had played football against at an opposing university. And they surrounded him. And he had just become a Christian, and one of them punched him. And before he punched back, he remembered what Jesus said. When someone hits you on the cheek, turn the other cheek. And he said, so I turned the other cheek, and he punched me again. I looked at him, I said, God did not tell me what to do after the second one. He said, so I beat him into the ground. That is not what Jesus is talking about here, okay? Joe Boyd, you can Google him, okay? That is not what Jesus is talking about. Listen, there's a number of words that Jesus could have used if he was literally talking about physical violence. Jesus uses a word literally that refers to the backhanded slap to the cheek. And it was a way in that time in history of referring to an insulting comment. In fact, we still use the colloquialism. Wow, you know what? That was a backhanded comment. That's what Jesus is talking about. And just as we didn't take out gouging out the eye literally or cutting off the hand literally, neither do we take a backhanded slap to the cheek literally. Jesus is talking about when someone insults you, how it's our natural tendency to want to insult them back. By the way, nobody was ever better at it than Winston Churchill. He was the master of backhanded comments. In fact, he had a little feud going with a lady named Lady Astor. And they went at it for years. And one time they were staying in the same hotel without realizing it. And Lady Astor was waiting for the elevator, and the doors opened. And Sir Winston Churchill was in the elevator with some of his friends. They were all so drunk. And she was just appalled. She said, Sir Winston, you are drunk. And he said, Lady Astor, you are ugly. And tomorrow I will be sober. Let that sink in. Okay? But that's a perfect example of slapping back an insult when someone slaps you with an insult. And here's the thing. The more you do it, the better you get. And some of us, if we're honest, we're really, really good at it, right? I mean, somebody can give us an insult, we can make it look really mild compared to the way we respond. By the way, you know where else we do this? When we drive. Anybody ever cut you off? Almost took the paint off the front of your car? What's your natural instinct? Find an opening. Get past them. Cut them off. You know what I'm saying? You don't say, well, bless them. I hope they're having a good day. No, you want to see, you want to get even. You want to retaliate. Jesus is saying here, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't give him the back of the hand. Charles Spurgeon said this, we're to be the anvil when bad men are the hammers. Let that sink in. We're to be the anvil when bad men are hammers. In other words, we're as Christians to take the blow of insulting comments without feeling the need to respond or to retaliate. Jesus says, let them glance off. walk away, ignore them. But let me say this, at no time are we instructed to be doormats to someone who wants to physically harm us. Because I say this because some people have taken this verse to an extreme. You never fight back. You never retaliate. I actually read some stories of some monks who would not even kill a bug, not even kill a mouse, because of Matthew chapter 5, verse 39. That everything had the right, if they offended you, and so they wouldn't kill them. So one commentator wrote this, I appreciated it. He said this, Christ's illustrations are not to be taken as the charter for any unscrupulous tyrant, beggar, or thug. His purpose was to forbid revenge, not to encourage injustice, dishonesty, or vice. True love takes action to deter evil and to promote good. He teaches not the irresponsibility which encourages evil, but the forbearance which renounces revenge. Some have taken this verse to ridiculous extremes and promoted an uncompromising pacifism. If they had their way, I'm sure the tyrants of the world would rule the land. So don't take it to extremes. I mean, good gracious, if you have rats, poison those suckers. You know what I'm saying? If you have roaches, take them on a trip to the Roach Motel, wherever you want to take them, right? But understand, Matthew 5:39 is not a basis for letting them live. It has nothing to do with that. And let me say at the same time, if our nation has an enemy, there's nothing here in Matthew chapter 5, verse 39 that says, just sit back, throw your hands up and surrender. That's not what Jesus is saying. Just remember, a slap on the cheek is an insulting comment. Jesus is saying this, release your right to personal dignity. Release your right to protect your honor. Release your right to retaliate. And this is what's interesting. When you do, the fight's over. The fight's over. If someone insults you, if you can just walk away, the fight's over. Now, unfortunately, let me say this. There are a lot of homes, maybe families, in disarray this morning because we don't follow this simple principle. I had a couple, I bet you, I met with counseling, marriage counseling, for 7 or 8 years. I just kind of held them together for 7 or 8 years. Finally, one day, sitting in my office, and I can still see them sitting there, the wife looked at me and she said, you know what our problem is? Neither one of us knows when to shut up. Neither one of us, our personalities, neither one of us are ever willing to back down and walk away. And guess what? They're divorced today. So Jesus is saying that, release your right to personal dignity. Swallow your pride. Walk away in the fight. Here's the second one. It just gets worse, people. So hang with me, okay? Release your right to cling to comforts. Verse 41. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Again, this isn't legal advice. This is personal counsel for Christians. And in this case that Jesus is giving us, this illustration, this would be someone who was well off because not only does he have a shirt, he has a coat. And I say that because in Jesus' day, a lot of people only had a shirt. It wasn't called a shirt. It was called a tunic. A coat was actually a cloak. It would be something that was wrapped around the shoulders, kind of like a cape. In fact, at night, it was used for a blanket when you slept. It was usually of some kind of heavy wool. So Jesus says this, if you come across someone and they're so poor, if they're having such a struggle that they don't even have a shirt, while you're at it, go ahead and give them your coat. Now, let's be honest. We live in an era where we feel like, as Americans, part of the American dream, the American way, we have right to any comfort we can afford. And I want to tell you something. There's not one place in the Bible that says having something that's nice, having comforts of this world is a bad thing. Now, if they own you, it's a bad thing. If they define you, it's a bad thing. But there's nowhere. There were some heavy hitters in the Bible. Abraham was wealthy. Job was wealthy. Joseph of Arimathea, wealthy. David was wealthy. Solomon was wealthy. Nothing wrong with those things. Nothing wrong with nice things. It's what nice things can sometimes do to us. And what nice things sometimes can do to us is make us very ostentatious. Shannon, every once in a while, will show me like, wow, look who just got back from New York. And maybe it's somebody she follows on social media. And see, this is the person who doesn't just get one designer purse when they're in New York. They got 5 designer purses. And now they want to go make a video in their closet, which is bigger than my house, because there's a special place for each, just to show how wealthy they are. I had a friend recently who spent multi-million dollars on a wedding. And he wanted everybody on the planet to know he spent multi-million dollars. We had this conversation on a wedding. I think that's what Jesus is talking about here. It's kind of the attitude, look what I have, look what I get to enjoy, everybody else, too bad, so sad, right? That's your problem. This is what Jesus is saying here. You didn't get that from me. That's not what my followers act like. In fact, this is a picture of a person who's moved over the needs of others to the point of selflessly releasing something. Not compelled to release something, they're just moved with compassion that they have the resources that someone else could use. I'm a pretty generous person, and I think anybody who knows me, who's been around me, will tell you I'm a pretty generous person. I can't hold a candle to my sister. My sister would literally give you anything she had if she felt you needed it more than she needed it. That's just the way she's wired. And if we're honest, just to throw this back into an illustration, most of us have a closet full of coats. In fact, we have coats that actually match all of our different outfits. But I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I doubt that most of us on a cold day have ever taken off a coat and given it to another individual who maybe needed it more than we do. Probably the closest we've ever come is donating one to Goodwill because we knew that we got a tax deduction. Because we're just, in our culture, we're not into giving coats. I remember years ago, I was teaching at Hope, years ago, and I happened to be referring to this verse. I wasn't even teaching on this passage, but I referred back to this verse, and it's like the Holy Spirit said, I got an idea. Have everybody here this weekend leave their coats. And I just seen on TV that WRAL was having a big coat drive. So I told everybody, when you leave today, leave your coats. Just pile them up in the atrium. We're going to donate them. Well, guess what people did? They left their coats. But you should have seen my email. How dare you challenge us to leave a coat without warning us you're going to ask us to leave a coat? Because I brought my favorite coat. And I had to leave my favorite coat because I would have looked horrible wearing my coat. They were so mad at me that they had to leave their nicer coat than their backup coat or their third string coat that they would have brought. But see, this isn't really about coats. This is about anything that somebody could use more than we could actually use it. So Jesus says, hey, if you want to be my disciples, release your right to cling to your comforts. Now, as I said, there's nothing wrong with having comforts. I've said for years, there's nothing wrong with having nice things. I've also said, if you can't be rich, have rich friends, because they have nice things, and sometimes they spill over on you, right? Here's the thing, there's nothing wrong with having nice things, but there's something terribly wrong when nice things have us, see, when they begin to define us. Okay, here's the third one. Release your right to your private lifestyle and schedule. Do you like to be inconvenienced? None of us do. Well, look at what Jesus said in verse 41. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Now, let me tell you why Jesus said this to this particular audience. Remember, the Jews at this time were under Roman rule, right? Roman occupation. There was actually a law. If you were a Jew and a Roman soldier tapped you on the shoulder with his spear and said, carry my pack for 1 mile, you, under law, had to carry that soldier's pack for 1 mile, or you could be arrested. The Jews hated this. They had this down to a science. They had figured out that 1 mile was about 1,000 steps. And so they would take that soldier's pack and they would be bitter for 1,000 steps. But when they hit step number 1,000 and they counted them in their head, they dropped that pack. So Jesus says this, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. This is where we actually get the expression, go the extra mile. What is Jesus saying? He's saying this, don't do what you have to. As my follower, get in the habit of doing more than what's expected. And I think sometimes we have to remember that when Jesus, he's teaching, he's not just limiting this to church life. He's not just limiting this to Christian circles. For example, this principle could apply where you work. I mean, the reality is Christians in the marketplace, there's something more important than quitting time. There's something more important than getting all of your lunch hour. In fact, there's something incredibly Christ-like about anyone who goes beyond what's expected of them, not just once, but as a habit. I tell you what, if you go to work that way, you will never have to try to find an audience of unbelievers to chat with. They will find you. They want to know what makes you different. Why is it they're sitting there for the clock to count down to 5, 3, 2, 1, but you're like, you know what, I'll get out of here in a few minutes. I need to finish this first. That's what Jesus is talking about. Here's the fourth one. Release your right to exclusive ownership. Verse 42. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Do you have something that someone else could use? I never knew how many friends I had till I bought my first pickup truck. Oh man, I had friends everywhere, right? Now here's the thing. If you live like this, there are going to be times when you get ripped off. You just have to go in knowing that. There are going to be times you say, sure, here's my truck, and you gave them a full tank of gas, and it's going to come back empty. That's going to happen. If you live like this, I can go ahead and tell you, sure, people are going to take advantage of you. In fact, I have never met a generous person in my life who hasn't been taken advantage of at some point. But I will tell you this, I've never met a generous person who is pessimistic or negative. Every generous person I know, even those who have been grossly taken advantage of, are people with incredible optimism. See, don't let a few ripoffs make you bitter. There will be some who need to borrow from you, so you let them. You let them. Now, does this suggest indiscriminate giving? William Barclay, you've probably heard of him. He's a commentator. He writes this. Are we then to say Jesus urged upon men what can only be called indiscriminate giving? The answer cannot be given without qualification. It is clear that the effect of the giving on the receiver must be taken into account. Now, listen what he says. Giving must never be such as to encourage him, this individual, in laziness or in shiftlessness. I like his word there. For such giving can only hurt. But at the same time, it must be remembered that people who say that they will only give through official channels and who refuse to help personal cases are frequently merely producing an excuse for not giving at all and are at times removing the personal element from giving altogether. Now you have to figure out where you fall there, right? So Jesus, he begins this passage by talking about releasing rather than resisting. And some of you are resisting the desire to give me a backhanded slap right now. But again, I'm just the messenger. I'm just telling you what it says. That's my job. That's my job. All of this stuff we're talking about, you're going to have to decide what you want to do with it. And I wish I could sit up here and tell you that I am a model of every one of these things, but I'm not. I'm a work in progress, just like you are. But you need to understand, this is what Jesus is calling us to. Okay. Matthew 5:43. It just gets worse. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. By the way, I will give you $1,000 if you can find that in the Bible. And obviously, I've checked. It is not in the Bible, so don't even start looking, right? $1,000, it's not in the Bible. Jesus never said that you can hate your enemy. It's never been written. The Pharisees are the ones who said, you can love your neighbor, you can hate your enemy. Now, the Pharisees knew better. They knew that Proverbs 25:21 was in the book. It's part of the Old Testament. It's part of the law. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. They knew that. We even know that. There's nowhere in the Bible where it says to hate your enemies. The Pharisees just assumed it was okay to hate the dreaded Philistines of the Old Testament. They just assumed it was okay to hate the Babylonians who took them into captivity in 526 BC. They just assumed it was okay to hate the Romans who were ruling over them in Judea right now. They just assumed that it was okay to hate them. And notice what Jesus says in verse 44. I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, if you want just a way to summarize what Jesus is saying, it's this. He's saying this. Love your enemies the same way you love your friends. Love your enemies the same way you love your friends. By the way, notice what Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't say, love your enemy's behavior. He doesn't say, love your enemy's lifestyle. He doesn't say, love your enemy's habits. Jesus just says, love your enemies the same way you love your friends. You know what this is? This is the ability to see beyond. See, that's what love does. It sees beyond. Love, it sees below the surface. See, love sees the soul in need of help, and compassion goes to work. Do you know where I've seen this recently, the way I haven't seen it in a long time? Do you remember a few weeks ago when we went home from church on an afternoon and the news popped up about a Mormon church in Michigan where a man drove his truck into the building, got out, shot 12 people, killing 4 of them, then set the church on fire and burned it to the ground? Did you see the story that the people in that Mormon church, remember he had a wife that he left and a child with some rare genetic disease? That church decided to raise $500,000 to give to the wife of the man who killed 4 of their members, injured 8 more, and burned their church to the ground. They've gotten over $300,000 on their goal to $500,000. My point is simply this. True love, not our romantic love, okay? True love, agape love, it sees beyond the treatment that it receives. True love doesn't need agreement to proceed, to move forward. True love goes against all odds. Let me tell you something. No neighbor was ever led to Christ out of hate. No. Neighbors that are led to Christ are led to Christ because there's a neighbor who knows Jesus loves that individual too much to mistreat them. He goes on to say, I tell you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. That, you know what that means? So that you may be father-like. Not like your father in Israel, not like your father on earth, not like your father here in North Carolina or wherever, but like your Father in heaven, that you may be father-like. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And that's true. I've actually checked this out. When it rains, I ride up and down my street. And I notice not only is it raining on my yard, it's also raining on my neighbor's yard, who lets his dog pee in my yard and make yellow spots all over my grass. That's the weirdest thing in the world. It's raining on his yard too. Not only that, think about this. Have you noticed that he allows his sun to shine on people who don't even know he exists? Who don't even like him? Now, why would God do that? Why would he allow it to rain on them? Why would he allow the sun to shine on them? It's because he sees the heart. He sees the soul. Understand, that's why Jesus was able to minister so graciously to people who hated him. He didn't see them. He saw their heart. That's why he could hang on a cross and say, Father, forgive them. They don't really know what they're doing. And I also think that's why the Roman soldier, when Jesus died, said, truly, this was the Son of God. It's what makes the difference. He says in verse 46, if you love those who love you, what reward will thou get you? I mean, it's easy to love people who love you in return. It's easy to love people who are just like you, who agree with you, who vote like you. Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your people, what are you doing more than others? Don't even the pagans do that. By the way, the pagans is another reference to the Gentiles. And just so you know, in the first century, Jews considered the Gentiles dogs. And I can't even use a synonym in church for what they considered the tax collectors. Jesus says, you love them. So let me ask you a question. This is the kind of stuff when you study all week you have to think through. How far do you take this? I mean, how far do you really take this? Do you love Hamas? Well, I don't love what they do. How about atheists? Yeah. How about criminals? Yeah. How about the worst neighbor in the world? Yeah. How about Democrats? Yeah. How about Republicans? Yeah. How about people with a different lifestyle? Let me come clean with you. I was in Costco with Shannon the other day. I do not normally do that. But let's be honest, Christmas decorations are coming out. So I said, I'm there. So we went in, I got what I wanted, put it in the cart as big as a semi, and now my job is simply to push the cart through Costco for the next 3 hours. And no, she actually gets in and gets out. But we're going through Costco. Okay, I see a dude, probably 40, beard, makeup, pink hair, blouse, dress, probably weighed about 250, furry tail coming out of his skirt. And I'm like, what a freak. I was so disgusted. Have you ever seen somebody you just, every time you pass them in there, you want to say something. I'm going to say something. Like, man, I don't know what happened to you. I mean, that's the way I felt. Have you got in the car? Did you see that dude? Did you see that dude? What is wrong with people these days, right? The next day, this is what I'm working on. And I felt like God said to me, hey, Mike, was there 1 second you thought about his soul? And I had to be honest, no. That never crossed my mind. But can you see how far we are removed from what Jesus taught? Are you beginning to understand this? See, this is why unbelievers aren't drawn to us. We're no different than they are. There's nothing about us that's different than they are. Why would they want to be like us? And then if that wasn't enough, verse 48, be perfect, therefore as your heavenly Father is perfect. And I read that and I think, okay, now you're just piling on. Now you're just being mean, right? But you know, this is what's interesting. God never gives us a commandment that's unattainable, which means there's something I'm missing here. Be perfect as God is perfect. So now I got to think. I do that at least twice a year. I got to think, okay, this is what I concluded. Okay, this isn't humanly possible. So what God must be saying to us is, don't be human. In other words, don't operate from a position of a human philosophy. You got to figure out, how do you operate day to day from the position of a divine philosophy? Alfred Plummer was a British theologian. He wrote this: to return evil for good is devilish. To return good for good is human. To return good for evil is divine. See, this is a divine kind of command. I think Jesus is telling this. I think he's telling us to aim for perfection. Which brings up the question, what's perfection? Well, the Greek word for perfect is teleos. Here's the definition: to reach full purpose for which something is made. Let's say I'm working on restoring a car in my garage, which I know nothing about, but there's something I can't do. There's something I can't get to. I can't get it off. I can't break a nut, whatever it is. But I got a neighbor across the street who's got a garage full of tools, and he comes over and looks at, oh yeah, Mike, they made a tool especially for this. Come on, I'll let you borrow it. And I go get his tool, I come back and I use that tool. When I use that tool has become teleos. That tool has fulfilled the purpose for which it was made. So what this is saying is this: as Christians, we have been made to be like God, Father-like. Romans 8 even tells us that we're in the process of being conformed to the image of Jesus. So if I understand this is what Jesus, when he's saying be perfect, he's saying this: our goal is to live the way that Jesus lived. In fact, this is what Jesus is saying in verse 48. Do it the way I would have done it. Handle it the way I would have handled it. Respond the way I would have responded. That's your goal. How do you apply this stuff? You know, what do you do with this? I think most of us have 3 relationship circles in which we live. We have an immediate family circle. Then we have a little bit broader circle of friends. Then we had the broad circle, which would include everybody, maybe even our enemies. Let me just quickly address these 3 circles. Here's the first one. With your family, release your rights. I'm telling you, there is not a family conflict that can't be settled if people aren't clinging to their rights. Whenever I do weddings, I use this line every wedding. God did not create marriage to make you happy. He created marriage to kill you. See, some of you are laughing because it's working, right? But what I mean by that, God created marriage so you would realize, without dying to myself, if we can both die to ourselves, if we can both die to our will, our ambitions, our goals, and mutually submit to one another what God is doing, that's going to be a great marriage, right? Now, I know things have to be negotiated, and I know there are rights and wrongs. I'm not ignoring that. I'm just saying, if both people would approach it where I'm releasing my rights, most conflicts are resolvable. Most really are. Here's the second one. With your friends, look beyond the wrongs. In any friendship, if all you do is focus on the wrongs of the other person, it's not going to be a friendship very long. But if you can focus on the benefits of having that friendship, you can get past the wrongs. I can tell you this. Every friend I've ever had has let me down. Every person who's ever had me as a friend, I can promise you this, I've let them down at some time or another. But because there's a willingness not just to focus on the wrongs, but to see the benefits of being in a relationship, see, you can get past it. Look beyond the wrongs. Here's the third one. With your enemies, fulfill your role. You be the wrench in their life. You be that tool. You live in such a way that it's a perfect fit for the thing that they're missing in their life at that moment. And you let God use you. You'll see it's remarkable how God can bring you together with other people, even the people that are your enemies. Now, for a few individualistic souls who are thinking, I can't wait to get out of here and live like this. This is going to be fun, right? Well, let me bring you back to reality. If you walk out of here today and say, I'm going to live like this, I think you should. I want you to understand there's going to be misunderstanding. And you need to understand there's going to be mistreatment. And you need to understand going in, you're going to be taken advantage of. I mean, think about it. The only one who actually lived this life perfectly ended up nailed to a cross. But you know what? I still think it's worth it. Can you imagine what kind of church we could be if we got to this place in following Christ? Now, I left a slogan out at the beginning on purpose because I wanted to leave it for the end. Another slogan that rose up in my lifetime is, we shall overcome. That was not original, by the way, with Dr. Martin Luther King. William Wilberforce attempted to free the slaves in England in the early 1800s, and if you study history, you'll see that they just destroyed him. The lies they said about him, the slander, the false rumors, it literally took his life. Lincoln took up the torch as president, and as a result, also became the object of hatred. And by the way, not just in the South. If you ever want to do a great read, I think it's a five-volume set, Lincoln during the war years, just if you want some good historical reading, you will not believe the abuse he received. It is beyond comprehension. And I know technically died of an assassin's bullet, but I think he actually died of a broken heart. When Martin Luther King Jr. began to promote the vision of nonviolence, you know how those of you who were alive, the South loaded up. He endured incredible injustice. I was just reading, his house was bombed. Think about this, for 13 years, he lived every day for 13 years with death threats. Can you imagine living under that? He was accused of being a communist. He was stabbed by a member of his own race. He was jailed over 20 times. In fact, he wrote many of his sermons that he preached on the weekend from jail. But this is what he said. Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. Let me say that again. Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. And you know what? He died believing that. Now, I'm not saying that King or Lincoln or Wilberforce were anywhere near perfect. I'm just using them as an example because I want you to understand when you live for a cause that is so different from what society is used to that it rebukes people, they're going to hate you for it. They're going to hate you for it. Nevertheless, I want to encourage us. Let's just follow the teachings of Jesus. Let's see what happens. Let's just trust him to bring good out of ultimately just really living life his way. I mean, it's really that simple. All right, let's pray. Father, we pause at this moment just to thank you for truth that never, ever fails to reprove us in our unbelief, our selfishness, our self-centeredness, our prejudice. Father, I pray that you would forgive us for living so many years looking for an excuse not to live like this. Fighting you over every little fight, mainly because we don't want to release. We want to hold on to our rights. I pray that through what we've heard today, maybe that you could show us another way. And Father, I would ask that you would just start with me. Father, I pray that you'll use these words, as stinging as they may be, as a catalyst for all of us to begin to change so that we can make a difference. And we can experience that teleos, that perfection of being father-like, not because we can do it, but because you can live this way through us. May we see that happen. In your name we pray.